Yesterday, I recorded a segment that was titled "The Surgeon General Says," and it was in reference to how the scientific and medical community has basically mislabeled smoking for so long as a habit as opposed to as an addiction. And I actually read the one paragraph when there was only one paragraph in the whole original Surgeon General report that actually even used the word addiction. And when it used it, it was basically saying that smoking was not an addiction. I'm going to discuss a little bit why that happened. Why, at that point in time, did the Surgeon General of the United States and the committee that formed that report not believe smoking was a drug addiction? To be an addiction, to be considered an addiction back in 1964, a drug was supposed to meet three very specific criteria. There were other sub-criteria that would be nice to have been met, but they really weren't essential. If three of the three primary criteria were met, then it was legitimate to call a drug an addictive substance. The first criteria of a drug to be called an addiction was withdrawal, meaning if a lot of people use the substance, abruptly stop using it, that a certain percentage of them would experience a drug withdrawal syndrome. Well, that one was never debated. There were very few smokers who would debate that because when they tried to quit, a lot of people got withdrawal, and the scientific community knew that. They had categorized it, they had named it. It was called nicotine abstinence syndrome. So they had a title for withdrawal. But you see, withdrawal was one of three criteria. It wasn't three of the three. The second criteria that really had to be met back in '64 for a drug to be called an addiction was tolerance. Tolerance meant that the longer a group of people used the substance, the more they would normally need. Well, that one was not highly debated either. There are very few people who take a cigarette one day when they're 12, take a nice deep drag, go, wow, that's great. I'll smoke 2 packs a day the rest of my life. It takes people years to get to the levels that they eventually get to that they may sustain for decades. Very few people took it up in one day and they're smoking full-fledged the next day. Ex-smokers relapsing do this, but new smokers, it very rarely occurs. So it met the second criteria, and it met the first criteria, but there was this third criteria, and cigarettes didn't meet it. For a drug to be called an addiction back in '64, it was believed that people would resort to some sort of antisocial or deviant kind of behavior in order to get to the substance. And everybody said back in 1964, people didn't resort to antisocial deviant behaviors in order to get the cigarettes. One of the ways that this is really evident in a sense of why the Surgeon General Committee would have believed this, most of the Surgeon General Committee were cigarette smokers. Luther Terry, who was the Surgeon General when that report was released, was a cigarette smoker. He literally quit. If I'm reading right what had occurred at that time, he quit prior to the report being released, and I mean days prior to the report being released, but he smoked all the way through the time the report was being compiled, being printed, being distributed, and it was within a very short time period of its release that when asked by a reporter, does he smoke, he said no. And then when he asked, well, how long ago did he quit, he said 30 minutes ago. And he never went back after that. So the belief of these people it didn't resort to antisocial deviant behavior. I mean, these people were doing it. And most people, over half the men in this country were smokers. And nobody was going to label over half the male population as antisocial and deviant because they were smoking. It was the norm. It was expected. And people didn't have to resort normally to very bizarre behaviors in order to get to cigarettes. That was true in 1964. Cigarettes were cheap. They were extremely readily available. You can use them anywhere, anytime you wanted. Oh man, if you were in a doctor's office, you were going in for some tests, and you were nervous, or you were going to get some results of tests, and you were nervous, and you didn't somehow have cigarettes with you, you could have almost easily said to the doctor, as he's about to give you results, like, you're kind of nervous, and man, can I have a cigarette right now? And there was a pretty good chance he could go into his pocket, pull out some of his personal stash, and give it to you, because he was a smoker. I mean, this was not atypical at this time period. So again, people were not considering this an antisocial or deviant behavior when you had so many professionals, well-educated professionals, medical professionals, who were doing it. While it may not have seemed obvious that it was an antisocial deviant behavior during all this time period, it was. And there were certain populations that they could have looked at to have realized it. One, if they look back a little bit historically, populations that were not able to get cigarettes, that were deprived of cigarettes, who had access to them before. And if you looked at the behavior that some of these people were doing, it was obvious what the behavior that they were doing now was a drug-seeking kind of behavior. I first started doing my clinics in 1976, and I was doing them in Chicago. Literally, I worked for the American Cancer Society for the Chicago unit, so my programs were, all my clinics were in Chicago proper. In 1978, I left the American Cancer Society and I started working at a hospital that was in suburban Chicago. The suburb was Skokie, Illinois. Skokie, Illinois had a significantly large Jewish population. There were a number of people in my early clinics. I was in the Skokie-based clinics for over 20-some years. Now, in the latter clinics, this wasn't the case, but in my early clinics in Skokie, I had a number of concentration camp survivors in those smoking clinics. These people remembered when they were in camps, they were starving to death. They remember there were times where cigarettes were somehow available, whether it be by other prisoners, whether it was by guards, but somehow where cigarettes were available. They were, at those times when cigarettes did somehow become an option, they started trading away food for cigarettes. These were people who were starving to death, and they were trading away food when cigarettes were available to them. It's going on, it was going on back then in third world countries. It's going on today in third world countries. There are people there are parents who are starving to death. They have kids who are starving to death. And still, when cigarettes are available, these people, in many cases, are smoking, meaning the only way they're able to afford these cigarettes is they are trading away either food or money that should be going toward food to support smoking. If you look at populations that are smokers who can't get cigarettes, you start seeing some very strong behaviors that are indicative of drug seeking. And smokers can look at their own past experiences. Ex-smokers. Ask ex-smokers, have they ever gone through ashtrays and taken out butts and smoked them? You know what? A lot of them have done this. You ask them, have they ever gone into ashtrays and taken out somebody else's butt and smoked them when they didn't have their own? A lot of them have done this. I always tell people when they're quitting smoking, destroy their cigarettes. And I mean destroy the cigarettes. And when I say destroy the cigarettes, I don't mean break them in half and throw them in the garbage. Reason being, the question of, have you ever gone into your garbage bag and taken out a butt and smoked them? And you would be amazed that, again, it's probably about 20-some% of the people that I run through clinics have done that little behavior. These are people who, if they had just finished a meal and they had probably their favorite food and they were done, it was good, perfectly prepared, but they were stuffed, they were done. Throw the meal out in the garbage can, literally 20 or 30 minutes later, start to get hungry. These are people who generally are going to think, hey, there's probably a little bit of that food down left in there. I can just go down there and get it. No, when it's in the garbage. When food is in the garbage, it's garbage. I don't care how good the food is. I don't care how perfect it was prepared. When it's in the garbage, it's garbage. It could be in an empty garbage bag. It's still garbage. Cigarettes. Oh man, if you run out and the only place they happen to be is stuff you emptied from your ashtray into garbage, well, you'll dig through other garbage to get to it and then use this product. I always tell people, like the second or third day of the clinic, they could be walking down the street. They've quit now, 48 hours. They'll see a cigarette in the gutter, one cigarette, and they get all excited. Their eyes almost light up. Oh my God, I can get 2 or 3 puffs off of this thing. And again, if they had a clean package of cigarettes in their pocket, if they had just smoked 10 minutes earlier, if they hadn't quit smoking at all and they saw cigarettes in the gutter, oh, that's litter. But here, it tempts them to want to be able to go and get that cigarettes. And hey, there's times where people do it. It shows you that cigarettes really always met the third criteria. It was just when they were so available and so easy and so cheap, people didn't have to resort to those behaviors. But when the availability was gone, people would go to that kind of behavior. Cigarettes met the old criteria. Since then, they've revised criteria. They've added other things in. Cigarettes meet the old ones better than they met the new ones better than they met the old ones. But the fact is, they always met the old criteria too. People have to recognize what they are fighting here. When you are quitting smoking, you are fighting a drug addiction. Being that you're fighting a drug addiction, you're not fighting one cigarette. You're not fighting a package of cigarettes. You're not fighting a carton of cigarettes. You're not fighting 1,000,000 cigarettes. That's not what the fight is when we're dealing with this as a drug addiction. You are fighting a puff a puff, any administration of nicotine, that is where the battle line must be drawn. If the battle line is drawn at any other level, any higher amount, it's going to be administered, and it's going to take the person down a path that they were on before, a path that in a sense was destroying their lungs with every puff they were taking, it was destroying their health in general, and would eventually take their life. You need to understand this concept, whether, again, the scientific or medical community accepts it or not. Every individual smoker wanting to quit smoking, and every ex-smoker wanting to stay off smoking, they need to accept this premise that they are nicotine addicts, and the way you beat that addiction, the way you take control, and the way you make sure that it never takes control back over you again, is to make and to stick to a personal commitment to never take another puff.